Thanks for tuning into the Football Talk Squadron, as I forget what the name of our actual organization is. I'm Dutch.
And I'm Maul.
Welcome to our college football episode. I'm going to change it up. I let Maul know this going into this episode. I think it will be a little bit more unique. Is with all the different scenarios, it's sort of pointless, in my opinion, to like discuss how the committee ranks teams. Like last night, for example.
And to be completely honest, I'm sick and tired of talking about it because it's just like you can't apply logic to it. Like I am convinced now at this point that like the system is just completely screwed up. There's just like no redeeming qualities to it anymore as far as how they're doing it, and it just needs to be changed. Like the way that we currently have the setup needs to be abolished as far as the rankings go, and there's just this season alone, like it's easy, or there's always like those what ifs when it was like you had 3 undefeated teams and it was like real easy. Like even last year, as much controversy as there's really only controversy kind of around the one team of Florida State, you know what I mean? But everything else, like it was pretty kind of cut and dry. Even if we would have had a 12-teamer last year, it would have been pretty cut and dry. It wouldn't have been like super controversial. But years like this, especially with these super conferences now, like they're just proving over and over again that the system is not designed to handle this. And the way that they're currently doing it is just causing more and more problems, and it needs to be, abolished and then, started over from something new that makes more sense for this current environment.
Yeah. I could go on a diatribe, but I'm going to try to hold. I agree with you. I think the biggest thing is that if I could say one thing about the committee that I would almost say, if they would just say this, I'd be like, okay, I get it now. Is you just go, we don't have rules. We just go based upon what we think is the best team. And if you just said that, then I'd go, we could argue about getting rid of committee members, but at least I wouldn't feel like you didn't honor things that you said you were going to honor, like going into the season, because things that they said don't matter when it comes to the rankings. So I'd rather you just say these are not really guidelines. They're more like, I forget what they say in Pirates of the Caribbean, where he's like, it's not a guideline. It's more just like a thing that we sort of say we might do.
Yeah, it's like it's more of a suggestion.
Yeah, for real. So
I'm the more and more like every week that goes on, like I am convinced until I hear a better idea. Like I have yet to hear a better idea than my idea of just like map of the United States, 12 circles. You play everybody in your conference, and then that's the way you get in. Like because if they want to keep the current structure, they have to change the scheduling. Like they can't keep these schedules where 6 of your top 8 teams haven't even played each other, and you're trying to rank them who's better or not. Like it's ridiculous.
We'll get into that. So how we're going to get into it, we're going to go conference by conference, and we're going to really get into this like idea that the theoretical I posed to Maul was I'll present a scenario and he tells me whether or not this team should get in, and if they should, who he thinks they should bump out in this scenario. Now, we're going to start not with arguing against who should get bumped out. It's more like I really think this is like going to be eliminating some teams. So, Big 12 championship, there's 3 teams right now. There's 4 technically with Iowa State. They have a way longer path to get in. It's really between BYU, Colorado, and Arizona State. Colorado and Arizona State both have 2 losses. So my question to Maul is, if Colorado or Arizona State faces BYU and BYU gains a second loss, is there any chance of BYU getting in with 2 losses, being the runner-up?
Do I think they should get in, or do I think that the committee puts them in?
We'll go both of your thoughts on that.
So whether or not they should get in, based on my opinion, is it's the classic. It depends. It kind of depends on like what happens the rest of the season with some of the other teams. As it stands right now, I think they should, but it's still a tough, like it's a tall order to try to explain around whether or not they should get in. If whether or not the committee puts them in, I would say like 90% no. Like the only chance I think BYU has right now of getting in is by winning their Big 12 championship.
I would agree. I think the only way they can backdoor their way in is stuff before the conference championship games. Like Alabama has to lose to Oklahoma, Texas A&M has to lose to Auburn, Georgia has to lose to Georgia Tech. Like multiple teams have to go down.
And I will say, if it's to anybody other than Colorado, like Colorado's kind of snuck up on everybody right here. So if it's not Colorado that BYU's facing, if it's Arizona State or Iowa State and BYU loses, then it's 100% no chance that BYU's in.
Correct. I'm also going with the scenario that none of the three, like Colorado and Arizona State and Iowa State, all have 2 losses. And I'm sure you're probably with me on this. If they pick up a third, they're out. There's no chance they're getting in being the runner-up.
Yeah, so then the case for BYU, this is where it gets tough. This is where it's like if you took away the brand, or if you just gave them a different brand, it's a completely different scenario. BYU has played multiple ranked opponents. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but when they played them, I want to say like 4 or 5 different ranked opponents. You could fact check.
Namely SMU.
But it's a lot. They've played a lot of ranked opponents. Now, this is where I say the branding comes into play. Most of those opponents are no longer ranked. That's where like BYU loses steam. However, I always just go back and go, make this Ohio State schedule. And you have Ohio State who's beat 4 or 5 ranked teams, but are no longer ranked. You think the committee cares about that at all? Absolutely not. They're like, Ohio State beat 4 or 5 ranked teams, period, dot. And that's it. Ohio State's probably the number 1 team in the nation with that type of schedule. You know what I mean? So
I agree.
That's where I don't like it, but I say that's where like they should get in because they've beaten a lot of ranked teams. However, those teams aren't ranked now, so this is where like you play that game of like, are we looking at them at the time of playing, or are we looking at them at the end of the season? And it's a tall order for BYU to kind of overcome that if they get that second loss. I hope they don't. Like, nothing to take against Colorado. I think they're playing fantastically. Like, I can't even believe that they lost to Nebraska. That feels like ages ago because they're 2 completely different teams.
I think if they play today, Colorado wins.
Yeah, probably, honestly. I hope BYU gets a shot at somebody in the playoff just to be there because they've had such a good season that if it was any other team or any other brand other than BYU, they would be in for sure.
I started with sort of the lower tier brands in terms of conferences. We'll go to the next tier up with the ACC. So right now, provided they win out, it will be Miami versus SMU, both with 1 loss. The only other possibility is that one of those 2 teams loses an ACC play, allows Clemson to come in with a 2 loss. My question for you is if the scenario plays out where it's Miami versus SMU, are both in, the winner's in, is the loser automatically out regardless? In your opinion, just sort of what you think happens.
Again, this is where it's like it kind of depends what happens with the rest of the. Primarily, it's like it's all going to come down to like what happens with the Big Ten and the SEC, like how many spots are left. Which I'll go up on a little bit of a tangent here of like the fact that Notre Dame isn't even playing in a conference right now. Like that's just so broken. Again, just another flaw in the system because they're pretty much in at this point. Like I guess unless they lose to USC at the end of the year,
or Army.
or Army. I mean, like, I don't see Notre Dame not being in at this point, even if they lose one of those games. There's someone's going to make a case for them to stay in. But the fact that Notre Dame's not even playing in a conference, it's just taking a spot from someone like this. So again, I would say typically yes, especially since again, you're kind of assuming this. You got to make a lot of assumptions here. SMU's only loss is to who? BYU, right?
BYU.
Which, if BYU ends up being the Big 12 champion, how do you knock SMU for their only loss being to two conference champions, right? Like, if say they lose to Miami, it's like they've got two losses, both to separate conference championships.
So we're now both in the playoffs.
Yeah, again, like, make Ohio State that team, and like that's the easiest. They're in for sure. You know what I mean? But the fact that it's SMU, I don't know. Miami actually has a worse case as far as getting in if they lose, because their other loss was to Georgia Tech, which has shown glimpses of really good ball, but like nobody's really counting that as like a good loss. This isn't like a Penn State scenario where the only thing good you can say about Penn State is that they have a loss against Ohio State. So like Miami isn't really in a great spot here. They kind of need to win. I think SMU should have a better chance of getting in even if they lose, but Miami is a harder hill to climb there.
You brought this up. I was going to wait until we got to the end of this, but since you brought it up, I'll just go into it. This to me is where we're sort of talking like, hey, what do you think about this team getting in? Not really who would you argue to kick out. Notre Dame's the team to kick out. It's not being talked about, but it's like the reason that either Miami or SMU is going to pick up another loss is because they have to play in a conference championship game.
Yep.
By you not playing in a conference championship game, you're guaranteeing yourself to not lose, which I sit back and I go, there has to be a punishment for not having a conference. Like, and if that means that you take a 2-loss, because let's be honest, I get that 1 is smaller than 2 in the win-loss column. Notre Dame has by far the worst loss of any team that's competing for the playoffs right now.
Yeah.
Like BYU's to Kansas. I guarantee you Kansas beats NIU. I watched NIU last night. It was terrible.
Oh, yeah, NIU's terrible.
They're third or fourth. They're 3-3 in the MAC. Like, let's just start with that going into last night.
They're the only team that has a loss to a non-Power 5 opponent, I think. Like, anybody who's being considered, their losses are at least to Power 5 opponents.
Correct. In terms of Notre Dame. So that to me, like when I sit back, your SMU argument, like if I'm SMU and I'm getting left out of the playoff, it's like I lost to BYU, who, especially if they win conference champion, I lost to Miami, my own conference champion, but you're going to put Notre Dame in, and they lost to NIU. Like that would be my going in argument for any conference runner up is I played in a conference. I'm being punished.
This is, I mean, you've brought it up multiple times where like the conference championship is going to start becoming obsolete or like even a hindrance, right? Where it's like, dude, I almost don't want to play in the conference champion because now I'm exposing myself to possibly another loss. And if I was on the bubble to go in, another loss is going to definitely kick me out. So,
well, in this, what you just said, I saw from the committee last night to hedge this, because I think there's a lot of like, what you're talking about of losing a conference championship game and it being like a detriment to play in is not what they want. They like the super, and by they, I mean the Big Ten and the SEC. Like that's a premier market game. They want that game to be big. They want it to mean something. Alabama jumping ahead of Miami, moving 3 spots up after beating Mercer, is because they have the next highest chance outside of Texas of playing in the SEC championship. They are setting the stage that if Bama loses to Texas, Bama will still be in, like provided Bama wins out. Like that's just what I'm seeing from the schedule. The same with Indiana. Like you look at Indiana and Penn State. If Indiana drops this game, they're what? They were number 5 last night. They're not going to fall out. Like they won't play in a conference title. They'll have 1 loss with Penn State. Penn State's the luckiest team in the country right now.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like,
I already said it. The best thing you can say about Penn State is that they have a loss to Ohio State. Like, ask any Penn State fan, like, why do you belong? And they're like, oh, well, our only loss is to Ohio State. Like, that's the first thing they'll tell you. And it's like, if the best thing you can say about your team is a loss, I'm sorry. Like, I'm not saying that they shouldn't be like ranked or shouldn't be like in the discussion, but like, you shouldn't be number 4. You know what I mean? And that, because then you have to go, well, what's the rest of your body of work? Oh, you almost lost to USC, who's terrible and have kind of, I don't want to say barely been beaten teams, but like they're not showing up. They're not looking like, I mean, at least Indiana's blowing these teams out.
Now we can get right into it with the Big Ten. You bring up Indiana. I saw this and
hold on. I got one more point I want to talk about.
Okay.
This conference championship thing. They need to make a rule. They need to change it somehow where they go, all right, we're going to come up with like the final rankings before conference championships. Meaning like we've got our 12 set, and if one of those happens to be the two of those happen to be the teams playing, they're both in. Or something to the effect of like, I don't have it all doped out, but like there needs to be something to the effect of like, if we've got 2 teams in the conference championship
that would have made the playoffs if the conference championship didn't happen,
like
then you're both in.
Or like even if one of them loses, let's say Bama in this case, because they got 2 losses, right? Let's say, all right, Bama's going to lose and have 3 losses. The only way that you can put in a team like, let's just for argument's sake say they're playing Texas. Okay, so Texas is guaranteed in. The only way you get to put in a team like Georgia or Tennessee or Ole Miss or Texas A&M for that matter means you then have to put in Bama, right? Like there needs to be a rule of like, you can't put somebody from the same conference in if you're not going to put both teams who played in the conference championship in. You know what I mean? Like that would be a good
I like that rule
where it's just like, if we're going to leave out Bama, well then we got to leave out everybody else in the SEC, because there's no possible way that you can tell me now, after that team played an extra game, proving just by the fact that they were in that game that they were better than the other teams, how all of a sudden can you put them ahead of them? Like that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So if you are going to put in a team like Georgia or a 3rd place, 4th place Tennessee, something like that, okay, that's fine. We can argue as far as they're better than the other conferences, blah blah blah, after the fact, but that means you then still have to keep Bama in there because they played in the conference championship.
I agree. I think that's a great point, because it makes it to where you sit back and that logic
keeps the conference championship relevant, because it's like, dude, if we can at least just get to that game, we're upping our chances of still getting in regardless whether we win or lose.
Correct. Big Ten. So this is where I'll talk. So Penn State, you take a look. We'll talk about Indiana as I pull up Penn State's schedule. So Indiana, after the Ohio State game, the only other team they will play in the Big Ten is Purdue. The Purdue team will mean that they have played 7 of the 8 worst teams in the Big Ten this season. Like the only team that they are playing from the top, Big Ten has 16 teams. The only team they're playing in the top half is Ohio State. So it's humorous to me, because this is the equivalent of like a Mississippi State beating Vanderbilt, Kentucky, Florida. You can just Mizzou, Oklahoma. They run through everyone, but they only lose to like Texas or Bama, or Georgia, and that's it. You sit back and look at Indiana, and I'm not trying to take anything away from them. They've done exactly what you've talked about. They've blown people out, but from a standpoint of what's their big win, what's their big losses, like you sit back and you look at the SEC, I get that they have 2 losses, but at least they can say we've had to play top tier teams. So
they played Washington. Washington's in the top half.
Okay. I guess I was wrong.
They're 8th of 16. So I mean, it's right there, but like
right there.
I get your point though. They haven't had a very tough schedule.
Penn State, the only ranked opponent that they've played right now who just snuck into the top 25, which I think was, this goes back to my conspiracy theory, was Illinois. Illinois is now the number 25 team, so it gives Penn State someone that they've beaten outside of because you talked about USC. USC looked great. They take them to overtime. Now you sit back and you're like, you don't even want to talk about USC. You're like, that's not a good win.
Yeah, wasn't a good win.
Wisconsin, you can sit back and argue to be a good win. But the funny thing is if you're going to prop up Wisconsin and say, oh, Oregon struggled, you can't. The problem with doing it for the Big Ten is you got Bama, who absolutely beat the brakes off Wisconsin at Wisconsin. So, like, when you do a head-to-head comparison, you're going to have to also sit back and go, the SEC team that played them beat them far better than either two of the Big Ten teams did.
Well, and this is the problem, though, is because they will do exactly that. They'll say it was a good win for one team, but, that doesn't matter for another team. You know what I mean? They do this cross-conference thing all the time of like, well, it was a good win. They're a tough team in the Big Ten. But then when an SEC team beats them, they're like, well, that is whatever. Or vice versa. They're going to say, well, SEC beat one of the top 10s in the Big Ten, and then all the teams that the Big Ten played them, they're going to go, well, that should have been a win. They don't apply the same rules across teams, across conferences. They don't do that.
Agreed. Let's say the improbable happens. Indiana beats Ohio State, goes to the Big Ten championship game undefeated. Will you agree that regardless of the outcome, Oregon and Indiana, if they're both playing undefeated, go to the playoffs?
Yes.
I thought so. The only thing I can possibly see that would maybe throw a wrench into it is a Florida State situation of a guy gets hurt, like Dylan Gabriel snaps his leg in half. The issue is I think after last year's debacle of Florida State and not being able to see a game before the playoffs, they'll still be in regardless.
Yeah, and because they have 12 spots, like in my opinion, in that case, the committee would find a spot just to put them in, just to quash all controversy in that state. Why I say so definitively why Indiana or Oregon will 100% be in is because they both beat Ohio State. And Ohio State 100% is making the playoff, period, dot.
Well, that was going to be my next question. Is
Yes,
a 2-loss Ohio State?
Doesn't matter. Ohio State could have 6 losses. They're still making the playoffs because the committee, that's what they do. Like, they would figure out a way to do it. So because both those teams beat Ohio State, no chance that they're going to leave one of them out because they have to keep Ohio State in. So they have to tell you that those other two teams that beat them are also worthy of a playoff spot, regardless of that loss.
So let's go into the scenario number 2. And I'll break down this game before getting into it, but Ohio State beats Indiana. We won't talk about whether it was close or by a wide margin. They face Oregon. They lose again. Is Ohio State in with 2 losses to Oregon?
100%.
Okay. Now, Penn State, they only have 1 loss. I'd assume they'd be in. This is where it becomes the real question of Indiana. Does the game this weekend matter? Like, what would it take in terms of Indiana losing that you think would eliminate them with 1 loss from getting into the playoff over a 2-loss SEC or the runner-up of an SEC team? How does this game matter this weekend? Or does it? Do you think they're still in regardless?
I don't think they're in regardless, which is sad to say. Personally, I think they should be, simply because we've almost kind of already, it's a foregone conclusion that Penn State is in regardless, right? And again, this is just like the brand differences. Like, I get it. Indiana hasn't played a whole lot of people. I'm not debating that, but Penn State also hasn't either, right? So like,
if this was Penn State's, switch the brands like you're talking about Penn State. There's no question that regardless of the outcome of this game, they're going to the
still
playoff.
In. Yeah, so that's where it's like they should be in. If we are considering that Penn State is a shoo-in, then yes, Indiana should also be a shoo-in. However, they are not in the committee's eyes. So from the committee, I am saying that Indiana is not a shoo-in. This game absolutely does matter. if they can keep it, if they can make it a good game, like if it is a legitimately good game, and I'm not talking like a bad game that just ends up being close, because I could also see that happening. That's a very likely scenario. But if it's like a good game where you're like, that was a fun football game to watch, like that was a good, two teams going back and forth, I think Indiana should stay in, or at least stay in after this week, right? So that's where it's like, even if they lose, but then lose to Oregon, that's where I know we kind of already talked about that, but like we'll see. That depends very heavily on what happens in the other conferences. If Ohio State blows them out, like if it's like 50-10 or like 45-13 or something like that, and like Indiana just never really had a shot in the entire ball game, that's going to be a tough pill to swallow for Indiana. They really just need to do better than what Penn State did against Ohio State, which I don't have the results off the top of my head. But if they can keep it closer to Ohio State than Penn
20
State,
to 13.
Yeah, so it needs to be something like that for Indiana to have at least an argument of why they should belong.
If they can make it, if they keep it close and closer than one score throughout the game, they go, well, we lost less than you guys did. You guys played at home. We had to go to Ohio State at night on the road. There would be an argument there that I can definitely see for Indiana. The reason I bring this up is based upon, before we touch the SEC, from the scenario that we've created so far, you'd have 5 conference champions that are all automatically in the top 5 ranked. Then from this, we're given 3 Big Ten teams in addition to whoever the conference champ is. So that's 8. So you only get 4 spots left, and this is where it becomes.
So that's what I was going to say. Like, you could very easily make an argument. The problem is you just start running out of spots. You know what I mean? Like, you got, like you said, the 5 conference championships. One of those is probably going to be like Boise State. We've already said Ohio State's in regardless. So it's like Oregon, Ohio State, that's 2. You've got Notre Dame, that's taking up another spot. Like,
and they're not in this. I didn't even throw them in. One Notre Dame, but again, now you're at 9.
That's what I'm saying. You start running out of spots super, super quick. And if you think that that the SEC is not getting at least 3 teams in at this point, you're crazy. So I mean, I could see 4 teams getting in for the SEC at this point. So again, you start running out of spots like really, really quick. And even though you can make a case for Indiana sitting there like, hey, we're still here, they're just going to go, well, sorry, we ran out of spots for you, and we don't think you're better than like a 2-loss Alabama team or a 2-loss Tennessee team.
That being said, SEC. So now the scenario I'm going to provide you is Tennessee wins out, Georgia wins out, Bama wins out, Texas A&M and Texas win out up until their game. And the reason that's important, it keeps everyone who has 2 losses at 2 losses. Texas A&M wins versus Texas. So they have 2 losses. One's the Notre Dame, which is really Notre Dame's like other huge.
Oh yeah, they're cheering for that.
Yeah, they're praying that happens. 2, they got beat by Notre Dame, beat by South Carolina. If they play Texas A&M versus Bama, are both in regardless of the outcome.
Who would play in the SEC championship at that
Texas
point?
A&M versus Bama. If Texas A&M beats Texas, it gives Texas 2 SEC losses. Texas would fall out of the SEC championship. The game, and this is why I say based upon all these teams winning out, it would put Bama versus Texas A&M. If Texas A&M beats Texas, the SEC championship game would be Texas A&M versus Bama. Do you think both teams are in regardless?
No.
I agree.
I think Bama is in regardless. I couldn't say the same for Texas A&M. Like, I'm not super confident even if they go to the SEC championship. This is one of those where I think that rule would play a factor. Like, if Bama comes in and beats Texas A&M pretty badly, they'll probably drop A&M out and then put Georgia or somebody like that in.
This is nightmare for the SEC, in my opinion, especially if Texas A&M wins the game.
They brought it upon themselves.
Yes.
This is what they deserve.
if Texas A&M wins, I would argue that Bama's out. Texas A&M's in, because then what you would be left with is you'd have Georgia, Ole Miss, Tennessee, and now Texas with 2 losses. The issue is that Texas never played any of them outside of Georgia. So you can't ding Georgia. Georgia in that scenario, I think, is in. So, and this is where it gets complicated. You got 5, let's call it, for right now, let's call 6 automatics, with Notre Dame being one of those 6. So you're fighting over 6 spots. You're going to say Ohio State's in regardless, and Oregon, and Penn State. So really, there's 2 to 3 Big Ten teams. So you're arguing over 4 spots, 3 to 4 spots. From this scenario, it's like, if you put in Indiana, I think that you look at Ole Miss, Georgia, Tennessee, Texas, it's going to be between the battle of the UTs of who gets in. It'll be between Tennessee and Texas. I think that you can't leave out Ole Miss because they beat Georgia. I get that they have a worse loss to Kentucky, but from that standpoint of they beat Georgia and Georgia beat Texas, I think Ole Miss sneaks in. Georgia's in. It's going to come down to, is it Tennessee or is it Texas? The issue is that even Tennessee, they didn't play A&M. Like, they lost to Arkansas, who Texas beat, and they lost to Georgia, who beat Texas. Like, it becomes a scenario. On the opposite side, if Bama wins, I agree with you. Texas A&M's out. Like, I think Texas A&M will be wiped off very quickly. The issue is, from that standpoint of, if Bama wins, now Texas is sitting there like, ugh, we lost A&M, who lost to Bama, who beat Georgia, who beat us. Like, it creates this mumbo jumbo of going in. I think that's the SEC's like nightmare scenario, is for Texas A&M, which I honestly like. That's sort of my sneaky, like, you want to like risk a little bit to make a little bit. It's betting Texas A&M to flat out beat Texas in 2 weeks.
I think, yeah, I mean, there's so many if, ands, or buts in that scenario. If Texas loses to A&M, I think they're screwed. I think that's going to be the nail in their coffin, even though they're going to sit there and go, well, we only have 2 losses just like everybody else. Yeah.
They don't have a big win.
They don't. And I think that's really going to hurt them. Like, because all those scenarios that you played out, you have all these like, well, even though we lost to this team, at least we beat this team. And it may not like be a 1-for-1 tit for tat, but like, it's at least like hey, I could put something in the pro column. Texas has nothing in the pro column if they lose to A&M. I think Texas's only route to the playoffs is by beating A&M and then going to the SEC championship. I think if they are in the SEC championship, I think they're going to be in regardless.
So if they play Bama, or both in. So Texas beats A&M, they play Bama, or both in your mind?
I think so, simply just because of the way the committee loves to put SEC teams above everybody else. That's going to be one of those scenarios where they're going to have to then put in like Ole Miss and Georgia due to the head-to-head stuff, and that's where Indiana gets left out.
Correct. And this is where, for me, the team that it will keep coming back to in this scenario, especially if, let's say, it gets complicated when Bama wins. I go back to last year. Like, the playoff was like real simple, but when Bama beat Georgia, it threw everything, because they were like, ugh, like, we weren't expecting Bama to win, and it would have been a lot cleaner if Bama had lost.
Yep.
Because Texas had beat Bama during the regular season last year.
Yep.
They did not want to put Bama in there, but leave Texas out, like, because of the head-to-head win, which I understand it from that standpoint. The issue this year, and you've complained about a lot, we all have, is that with the scheduling, it's not clean.
Yeah. You got 2 lost teams that both their losses are like at a conference, or like, another 2 lost team, which they're both ranked teams. It's just, you can't compare them. There's no real like finite way to compare the 2 teams. And that's why we're even having this discussion, is because that system is broken.
So I sit back and I go, if the nightmare, yet again, the nightmare scenario in this case is Bama wins. Because if Bama wins, now you give Texas their second loss. It becomes Bama's your automatic qualifier, and now you have 4 teams. You got Ole Miss, Georgia, Tennessee, and Texas all sitting there with 2 losses. I yet again go back to the same scenario. It's going to be the battle of the UTs of who gets in.
Yeah, I could see Texas being left out in that scenario. I could see them going, well, hey, now we have a better excuse to put Georgia in because Georgia beat you too. You know what I mean? Like it's so.
And Ole Miss beat Georgia, but then the kicker is Tennessee beat Bama. Like they would sit back and go, "We beat the SEC champ. You beat no one. You can't get in this scenario, even though they've made the SEC championship game."
So that might be a scenario that specific one, if it's coming down to like, let's see, Georgia, Bama, and then would say like probably Ole Miss is in that scenario. So that it's coming down to like Texas and Tennessee. That may be a scenario where the committee just goes, you know what, we don't really like either one of you. We'll keep Indiana in. I don't know.
Well, in that scenario, you'd have, we'll just call it Bama. We'll say Oregon wins. Let's say crazier things happen. Colorado wins. Let's call SMU winning. Then they have Notre Dame, Ohio State, Penn State. That's 7.
Boise State.
8 Boise. 9, 10, 11, 12. So in that, I could see that.
I can see them going Bama in, Georgia in, Ole Miss.
Well, Bama would be in automatically for the SEC championship. So then you'd be left with 4 spots plus Indiana possibly. So from that scenario, I think Indiana would get left out. I think they'd put all 4 SEC teams in.
I wouldn't put it past you because the absolute disgusting bias that they have, but sure.
This is why I just sort of, this is like the conundrum that's going to be created. Now, I heard a few guys talk about it on a different podcast that he was sitting back and he goes, if history's told us anything, it's rare that we ever get sort of like put into this situation. Like I can see Texas A&M dropping a game to Auburn. Like they go in Auburn late at night. Like that to me has upset written all over it because they play Texas next. Like
somebody's making a phone call going, yo, we need an easier scenario. We can't do this.
Well, I keep sending you guys, I'm not sure if y'all watch them all. Y'all haven't reacted to any of them, of that dude who's like acting like the playoff committee. He's they want drama. What you got? And he's like, I got something for you. That dude's, well, I just saw him. He sat back. He was talking about 2 guys are like interviewing to be in the playoff committee. And he's like, tell me what you think about this. You got a school that loses to non-Power 5 team. They were 28-point favorite at home. Where are you going to rank? And they're not playing in the conference. Where are you going to rank them? He goes, 6 sounds about good. He goes, you're hired.
Yeah.
Like when you say it like that, like and that to me is the biggest. I'm going to come back to this now that we're going to get into like, who do you think should be eliminated? In all these scenarios, if it's 1-loss Indiana versus 2-loss SEC schools versus whether it's a 2-loss Miami, 2-loss SMU, I think the biggest team that they have to target is Notre Dame. That would be my argument. You didn't play in a conference. I think that would force Notre Dame to go into a conference to be like, we're not putting you in. Like, sorry, you don't play in a conference. You don't have a hard enough schedule. Yeah, you played Texas A&M. Yes, you played USC and you played a few other schools, but you also like they sit back and they're propping Notre Dame up from beating Navy, and they're going to do it this week when they beat Army. There's a reason the committee has Army ranked so low, even though they're undefeated. It's because they're like, yeah, like in the head of the committee was the 3-star at the Air Force Academy. So I sit back and I go, if anyone would be like, I think they should be higher, it would be that dude. And even he's like, nah, they ain't that. Like that to me is why Notre Dame is like the linchpin to all the chaos. that no one's talking. Like, that's the thing that drives me nuts on ESPN is they don't address the fact that Notre Dame has no business being in.
Yeah,
None.
they're playing by like a different set of rules than everybody else.
Yes. Like, can you imagine if Bama was just like, because that to me is the bigger thing. Like, the super conferences, they get money, and that's the reason they're doing super conferences. But if you're like, I want to compete for a national title, I don't want to be in a conference at all. If you're Alabama,
just gonna play Northern Illinois and Marshall every other week and just show up undefeated and take that number 6 spot. I'm fine with that.
Yeah. Like, and in that scenario for Notre Dame, they truly do get a bye.
Yeah.
Like, because they didn't have to play in a conference title game, and they're most likely going to get a home game.
Yep.
Like, now, I would love it so much. Like, the playoff thing last night made me like laugh. So, Ohio State was playing. Give me a half sec. The bracket.
They'd be playing Boise, right?
They were playing BYU in this scenario.
Oh, because BYU. Wait, how are they playing BYU?
BYU would be right now. They would be a conference champ. Boise's ranked higher than BYU, so thus Boise's conference championship game, Boise would get a bye because they're the highest.
Oh, or they'd be number 4.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
In that scenario, Ohio State would get a home game against BYU, but then you look at the other home games. Notre Dame gets a home game against Bama. Penn State gets a home game against Georgia. Indiana gets a home game against Ole Miss. I'm here to tell you, SEC is going 3-0 in those games.
Yeah, I'm taking all the away teams.
Yes. Well, except for Ohio State. Like, Ohio State's getting a home game against BYU.
Oh, okay.
That's the only home team I'm taking. The other 3 are going to be absolute slaughter. Like, if you think that Georgia won't, now I get Carson Beck can always just be like, yo, you want to watch me try to lose to Penn State?
Keep this close.
Yeah. Ole Miss will boat race Indiana right out of the stadium. Plain simple. Like, Ole Miss.
They should.
They should. Lane Kiffin's done worse. Bama, Notre Dame, I just go back to the last 2 times Bama's. Yeah, I've seen that before. It didn't work out well. One, he hurdled a grown man, and the other one was in a national title game where they just beat the brakes. Did you ever see that Montateo, him talking about before the game? Have you seen it? They're like, what happened? And he's like, we're in the tunnel. And he's like, Bama comes out. And he's like, DJ Fluker, their starting offensive lineman, comes out. He's like, he's got his jersey. And they're like, what do you mean? He's like, he's got it tucked up underneath his pads. His big old belly's hanging out. And he runs by us. He's got 4 fingers up it. She just goes, whoop, whoop. And he's like, it's dead silent behind me. And he's like, I turn around. He's like, all my teammates are like this. And he's like, I was like, it's going to be a long day.
We're going to lose.
He was like, they were a different team. And that, to me, like, I just sort of sit back with each of those Big Ten teams. Like, if you think about who's going to come in thinking we're going to win this game, it's all 3 of the SEC teams. They're not intimidated to go into those environments.
100%. I've already talked about like how important that is in college. Like the Texas versus Georgia game. It doesn't matter how good you think your team is. When all of a sudden you're in this like, win or go home type of game, and you're facing Bama or Georgia. I don't care if you think, hey, we could pick Carson Beck off 4 times this game. The fact that you think I could pick this dude off 4 times, but we're still probably going to lose, like that just puts this doubt in your mind. And like, I think Saban said it a long time ago. Like when people beat us, they charge the field. But like when we beat people, it's just like, yeah, on the next one. You know what I mean? Like that's that mentality of those dudes that are just like, they're going to go in there. And if you don't think Penn State's going to be just trembling in their shoes trying to face Georgia, like I don't care if they're at home or not. Nobody in that stadium truly thinks Penn State's going to win, regardless of whatever whiteout they come up with.
I can almost guarantee you Georgia will be picked by 14 in a game.
Yeah.
Like every one of the SEC teams in that scenario, if you think Vegas is going to give you them as the underdog, Vegas isn't that dumb. Like Vegas ain't going to do that. Like it becomes comical. The other thing in this scenario is we haven't really discussed it yet. I talked about it when we first came up with our predictions. and this is where it's going to get very interesting. We talked about who's going to make the playoffs. The rankings at the end are going to be even more like you're going to see some wild stuff. And the reason I say that is if you think that they're not going to rank teams that certain matchups happen,
100%.
like why do you think Ohio State's ranked as high as they are? It's because they're going to get the number 12 team. Like that fifth rate conference champ, who's the lowest tiered dude, that's who's playing Ohio State or Oregon. Like whoever loses the Big Ten title game, that's who they're playing. They're playing an absolute joke of a team. I don't want to say that mean, but just like they're not playing a premier SEC, so they're not playing Georgia. You're not going to have to beat the best.
They're going to cook the books from the ranking standpoint to make sure that certain matchups happen to guarantee other teams certain paths. Maybe not like, give them the easiest matchup or whatever. Like they're trying to create a certain path either that week or the next week. And we played this game when we were doing at the beginning of the season.
Yeah.
I could see Georgia doing this, but they're going to rank them here because they don't want to necessarily see that matchup until, the Final Four or something to that nature. Like you absolutely know they're cooking books at that point.
Because if whoever Bama beats in the SEC title game, if that were to happen, I guarantee you they won't play them again until the Natty. And they're not going to have Georgia go replay Bama. They'll have it to where Ole Miss, if they win, they play Bama. Like they will create the SEC matchup to where you haven't seen it. It won't be the rematch until the championship game or one before the championship game. The scenario in this one that got me laughing was Ohio State gets BYU and then Ohio State gets Boise, which I'm just like, guys, come on.
That's your path. Yeah.
Yeah, that's your path. All to face Oregon again for the game before the Natty. That's the scenarios that I see happening. Also in this scenario, it was like Ole Miss versus Indiana to go play Texas. That way you didn't see Georgia play Texas again. Georgia versus Penn State to go play Miami. You wouldn't get the possible rematches until either the national championship or the game before the national championship. I'm calling it now. That is exactly what you're going to see after the conference championship games, regardless of how they rank them.
Yep.
Regardless. They will build it so there's going to be some games played with the rankings that you're going to be like, how in the world did this team move to here?
They're going to fill out the playoff bracket first of matchups, and then they'll go, okay, who needs to be ranked where so that this happens, and that's how they're going to rank them.
1,000%. And once we get to what's funny is I can guarantee you when we get to the conference championship, that's the game I was going to play is before the conference championship games, we'll build the playoff, and I'm going to be probably 95% sure we'll nail it. Like I'll have the matchup set. I already know what it is. And the teams that have a bye, like that to me, and that's where I sit back. If you're Georgia right now or Ole Miss, you're in a great position. I told you this in text. If I was Bama, I don't want to play in the SEC championship game. Why? I have to play a good team that's going to be physical. Like I risk injury. There's no benefit right now outside of this metaphorical bye. Like I'd rather win, and I'm probably going to be ranked one of the higher teams when all the dust settles. I'll take a home game in Tuscaloosa 10 times out of 10.
Yeah, and we've already talked about you're exposing yourself to a loss, right? Alabama as is right now. A lot of people are like, they should be ranked number one. You know what I mean? So it's like they're in, dude. They are in the playoff as it stood right now. They don't need to play another game like that. You're only opening yourself up to, let's say, I don't know if they could even play Georgia again. I don't think that's a possibility. But it's just not. What if they come out and get blown out? What if they just have one of those bad Milrow games and get blown out? Everybody's going to start questioning, well, is Bama really that good? Maybe, let's say it's Texas, because Texas is probably the weakest of all of those teams we've talked about from maybe Texas A&M. But it's Texas already lost to Georgia. So if Texas comes out and blows Alabama out of the water, everybody's going to be like, ooh, do we put Alabama in? When it's dude, just last week, they were a shoo-in. They were probably the best team from the SEC. So you're right. It's a weird the way it's set up now, again, I've said it, it's broken. Like, they don't have the right structure in place to make sure that these things don't happen, or that if they do happen, they have some safeguard to still make it make sense.
Which I sit back and you talk about it being broken. The 12-team playoff is not going to last. It's going to change. I think this year, if the scenario works out where you have a 1-loss Indiana, 1-loss Notre Dame, let's say Bama wins and you got Ole Miss, Georgia, Tennessee, and Texas, and someone gets left out, there will be changes because schools are going to sit back and go, enough. Like, I'm not doing, like, you gave Texas this favor. Like, if Tennessee got left out, Texas, like, I would be sitting there and be like, Texas didn't play anyone. They got beat by Bama. They got beat by Georgia. I beat Bama. Why am I out? Like,
you think changes as far as like they're going to increase the number of teams?
Yes.
Oh, gosh.
100%. Like, because that's the scenario I see is that eventually, because the conference we haven't really even talked about, like the ACC is going to be furious. Like if it's a 1-loss Miami versus a 1-loss SMU, and they're just like yeet to whoever that runner-up is. But then, because that would be my argument for either one of those schools. We didn't have to play in this game. We could have sat home and just been 1 loss and assured ourselves the playoff. Georgia and Ole Miss did the same, but they're automatically in. But I lost the game that pushes me to the same record. And now I'm out. They're going to make it where I think that whoever makes the conference championship games, and there will probably be some rule that you have to have a winning record, some type of like thing that whoever the runner-up is, you're still in, provided you meet some criteria.
They already have that rule. It's playing the SEC. It just means more. That's the rule.
Roll Tide.
It just means more. Like, that's the rule that they have.
The Big Ten's the same way. If you're Ohio State,
oh yeah,
like, I want to sit back and I agree with you with the SEC. I'm not arguing that point. I would also tell you that if you're Ohio State or Penn State, you're lumped into the same category right now.
You know what's funny is this is the first year that Penn State hasn't played Ohio State and Michigan, and we were talking about how good that was for Penn State at the beginning of the year, which it is working out for Penn State still, but they almost would have rather played Michigan this year. One, because they probably would have beat them, and then at least they can be like, well, see, we beat Michigan, but it's a joke. It's a broken system, and it's just getting really, really frustrating every week.
I think you're going to see the Big Ten do some schedule like that. The scheduling manipulation has to change in the future. It has to. You can't, because if I'm Georgia right now, I will give Georgia the benefit of the doubt from a standpoint of scheduling.
They're the only team that's played everybody.
Everyone. Yeah. They had to play Bama. They had to play Texas. They had to play Tennessee. They had to play Ole Miss. And the 2 games they lost were on the road.
And again, I make the argument of like, if you didn't think that was the only reason, like on purpose, because we all thought Georgia was going to boat race everybody all the way to the Natty, right? Like the only reason it was Georgia that's playing everybody is because we expected them to be undefeated at this point, and we were just going to have to compare the losses against Georgia, right? It's like, well, everybody lost against Georgia, so now let's compare the rest of our schedules. Like that was what the intent was. But now that there's all this mishmash of people beating people who shouldn't have beat people that then turned around and beat another person, it was like, well, shoot, we didn't expect this to happen. It's just like last year. And until they get that straight, where they have to play everybody so that you're comparing straight up who played who and who won, it's always going to be broken.
Can't argue with that.
I mean, this is why the BCS was broken too. Like, I know it's like, oh, well, it used the AP poll and these other polls, but it's like, look at the AP poll. We kind of just trust that like the AP poll is better than the other ones and it had the most weighting. But like, we've talked about it before. For the like 3 or 4 weeks, you had people voting Ohio State #1. And you're like, in what world did that make sense? But like, those are the things that went into the BCS that you're like, oh, well, the computer's figuring it out. No, it's not. The computer was just taking input from the averages human beings.
Yes.
You know what I mean? So it's like, it's going to spit out a dumb number if you have dumb input.
100%. I think the biggest the broken system in college football. I'll break this down in a later episode. I'm doing this like research project that I'm going to try to like prove this through like doing all the numbers. The NFL doesn't have a problem because at the end of the day, the NFL views all NFL teams as NFL teams. So a win versus Carolina in the AFC or in the NFC conference, if you're the Packers, is viewed just as heavily if you play the Saints. Like it is a win in NFC play that factors into the playoffs. Like it makes your rankings this. I sit back and I think both me and you will agree with this. If Southern Miss never played anyone and only played in the Sun Belt but went undefeated, I think we would still sit back and go, there's a problem here.
Yes.
Like you didn't play anyone. And until that like teams can quantify that and just say like, here's what like if Southern Miss went undefeated, but they didn't play anyone, here's what has to happen from all the other schools for you to even have a shot. And until that's quantifiable, when it's just people sitting in a room, like that like I go back to this, the committee members aren't watching Southern Miss play football. Like they do not care. So they could be undefeated this year. And it's not until probably about now where they're like 10-0 that they're like, well, maybe we should watch like it's just like Army. There's a reason Army's 18th. It's because no one's watching that game, which I will say, watching option football is one of the more miserable experiences that you will ever have in your entire life. Like
besides trying to defend it, it's also pretty darn bad.
Yeah. it's not entertaining football. Like there's a reason that the NFL has made it harder on defense to play defense because they like scoring. They like seeing the downfield shots. You don't get that in the option. You get it like 5 times a game where when your quarterback only throws 5 passes, it's going to eliminate a lot of different like variables in terms of marketability. The NCAA has to get honest about it. And what I wish they would do is they just go, if you want to do super conferences, cool. And just say, these conferences, you have 0 chance of making the playoffs.
Yeah.
Like, you're not playing in these conferences. Y'all can have your own game, do whatever you want, kick rocks. You ain't making it. Like,
yeah.
instead of
create
acting like there's a hope.
Yeah, new like D1, D2, D3 type of deal. Like,
yes,
y'all can do whatever you want, Southern Miss, but you're going to only compete for a D2 championship against other D2 teams, right? Like, this is where I go like back to my original thought of like, take the map, draw the circles. You can gerrymander the circles however you want, where like Southern Miss is also playing Ole Miss and Mississippi State and maybe Louisiana or, LSU. Like you can draw the circles so that you have good and bad teams kind of spread out throughout the country. Because if that's the case and Southern Miss goes undefeated, well, hey, they had to beat Ole Miss and Mississippi State to do it, right? And if that is what they do, well, then now they are deserving of that playoff spot. But in the more likely scenario, when they get wiped off the map every single time and Ole Miss is the champion every single time, you go, well, that is the best team, and they're going to be the best team in that conference till somebody else steps up. And that's your shot to the playoff every single year. You know what I mean? Like that's because you're only playing those teams.
Yeah, the only reason I never see it happening is that from like an SEC standpoint, they sit back and they're like, why in the world would we ever let Tulane back into the conference?
They wouldn't. Yeah, the money,
because the money's not there.
100%.
If you want the answer to anything, follow the money. Like there's a reason that the Big 12, in my opinion, eventually will implode and get sucked up by, it's going to become 2 major conferences. And eventually my theory is it's going to go back to one conference that what we're talking about of like, sorry, Southern Miss, you're not among the big boys. You're not making it. And until your revenue exceeds this and until you can recruit someone, you're not making it. Like,
well,
which I think NIL is going to,
I'd say what happens in the next few years when like the Pac-12 comes back with all these other different teams, because that's like a conference that we're not even talking about because they don't exist right now. But like if the Pac-12 is not dissolving like we thought there was going to happen, they're just taking different teams and they're just going to recreate the Pac-12. What happens then? You're going to have San Jose State playing for a they're going to get in the playoffs just because they won the Pac-12. That's like the Southern Miss scenario. You know what I mean?
Well, here's the scenario I'll give you, and this we talk about brands, and I get we harp on the SEC. I would argue it's not just the SEC; it's Big Ten, and it's really the big brands. SMU did not play in a Power 5 conference last year. They are playing in one this year. I'm here to tell you that if you took SMU's schedule right now, changed it, and you made SMU Florida State versus Miami, each of them having one loss, whoever loses that game is in.
Oh, yeah.
And it's not a debate.
Yeah.
Like,
agreed.
If Clemson was one loss and it's Clemson versus Miami and not SMU, whoever loses that game still in, like with one loss. That to me is where we're at. Is that SMU's getting no respect, that they're playing in a Power 5 conference. You got Miami ranked higher than them. What's the difference between Miami and SMU? Like, that Miami's looked a little bit better with Cam Ward, but Miami lost to Georgia Tech. SMU's sitting back and they're like, we only lost to BYU. Like,
SMU's also been boat racing people, and Miami's been struggling with virtually everybody.
Yeah. Like, that to me, this like idea of the brand plays so much of a factor when ranking teams. It's funny because this like I'm like crunching the data. I haven't even talked to you about this. I'm crunching this data from like 2014 right now, and it's hysterical to me. Brand name, Oklahoma. So this is 2014. You can tell when they lose. So they lose. Most people had them ranked in the top 5 to top 10. They lose one. Most of them have them around 15. They lose again. A lot of people knock them out of the top 25. Very next week, they're right back in the top 25. They lose again, a third loss, and they're still in the top 25. It takes until they lose 4 games before the final AP poll, where hardly, I think 2 people have them ranked. Like, but I sit back and I go, yo, I sit back, Georgia Tech had 1 loss the whole season. And Marshall had 1 loss in 2014. They didn't even scratch the top 25 until they were 11-0. And the second they lost, they immediately got booted from the top 25. It was
you know who that sounds like? Every SEC team to ever play. LSU, Missouri. Are we for real right now? Like,
oh yeah. Well, LSU finally got bounced. Okay. But Missouri should have been bounced too.
Exactly. But how many losses did it take for them to finally get bounced?
Missouri's still in.
4. Missouri's still in.
They got beat by South Carolina. Like,
that's what I'm saying. Like, what are we doing? Like, it's the exact same thing.
The AP poll, and that's the whole purpose of me doing this, is the worst thing for college football. Garbage. Absolute hot garbage. Like, it's 2024. The fact that we can't rank teams by different, in my opinion, the key to all this is how Vegas does it. Is Vegas wrong sometimes? Absolutely. They had Notre Dame favored by 28.5. Vegas, the vast majority of the time, and I know because I lose, they win. They win all the stinking time with spreads. They win a lot. They didn't build them fountains in front of the Bellagio based upon not
giving
winning
away money.
Yeah, they win all the time. Vegas has it figured out. Vegas knows how to. That's the whole thing that Saban was talking about which I get. Bama didn't get in 2 years ago with Bryce Young, and he was sitting back and he's like, Vegas has us picked to beat TCU by 14. Like, and everyone here, like, who's picking TCU if we play them right now? And I understand Saban's argument because of what's going on this year. Like, this is the exact scenario that he was talking about, which is you can't sit back and based upon how the committee's ranking teams not tell me that wins and losses matter. It doesn't. Like, they're not giving all the teams that are undefeated the 1 through 4 spots, then it just trickles down. Like, there's a game, and it's this like eye test, which is a word for we're going to make money through the matchups of the games. That's the eye test. Does it meet the money threshold that we're looking for?
Is it marketable?
Yes. Is it marketable? Like, I think that eventually they're going to get rid of the 5 conference champs things. They're just going to say the 4. Like, and if you're ranked higher BYU because you went undefeated and the Big 12 didn't have anyone, then you'll be the team that's in. But I see them doing away with it. Like when Boise State gets eventually, in my opinion, I hope that it happens. I hope whoever, even if it's Bama, if they play, and I hope that Genty rushes for 200, 300 yards, puts on a spectacle, and everyone's just like, oh my God, this is why it should happen. This is why a team should be in. But if this year, if like Ohio State plays Boise State and they beat them 52-0, everyone's going to be like, get rid of this team. That was the worst thing for the playoffs, is having that 5th conference champion, and they'll do away with it in a heartbeat.
I mean, I can absolutely see that happening, because that way it doesn't tie their hands anyway. They have freedom to basically do whatever they want. And I don't want to say it's going to be pay for play, because there's not like, teams aren't necessarily lobbying to these guys, but I mean, that's basically what it is now. And they changed the rules anyway. So the fact that they wouldn't have that rule to limit them, or like, man, we really wanted to put Tennessee and Texas in, well, we got to put stupid Boise State in instead. Like that allows them to just go, you know what? Let's put Tennessee and Texas in. Screw Boise State.
Yes.
They weren't going to compete anyway.
It's going to happen. Notre Dame's going to be in the same boat. Eventually, Notre Dame will go undefeated in the regular season. And when that happens and they don't get an automatic bye, they're going to be like, this is absolutely outrageous. We're one of the best teams. And the next year, they're going to be like, okay, no more automatic buys. We'll just rank them 1 through 12. Like, yeah, money talks. The reason that Notre Dame's in it, for anyone that doesn't know, is because NBC stands for nothing but Catholics. Like, I remember hearing that a long time. Like, they pull, and it's not from a religious thing, it's a money thing. Like, they pull so much of the market because people want to watch Notre Dame. They have a channel that is dedicated to their team. Think like ESPN and ABC and CBS, they pay money to the SEC and Big Ten to represent. We want your games on TV. NBC is like, we will just pay Notre Dame to just show Notre Dame games on our channel. Like, the amount of money, that's the reason Notre Dame doesn't want to go conference. They don't want to share that NBC money. It's like, we're fine. Like, we have our market share. We don't need help money-wise. Thus, they don't want to be in a conference. They don't want to split their revenue because they're fine.
Yeah, and I don't blame them. Like, I mean, this was like a few years ago, the same deal with like Georgia and Bama. Like, why would you ever play a difficult schedule? You could literally show up, play 12 cupcakes every single week, just go undefeated, and like, you were in regardless, because you were Georgia or Bama. Like, and again, it's like, it's dumb, it's bad for the game. Okay, well then change it. Like, but until you do, you can't fault the teams for creating these types of schedules, or benefits, to give themselves an upper hand at making it.
100%. This is why, for the Big 12 dissolved, and really it started the Super Conference when the Longhorn Network was invented. It ruined it. It started this like whole snowball, because Texas was like, we're just going to have the Longhorn Network and we're only going to make money from this. We're not going to profit share anything from the Longhorn Network on or through the Big 12. We're going to keep all the shares. Well, the Big 12's furious. Then the SEC network stands up, and the SEC says, hey, we'll share it amongst all the teams, because each of the teams, when you have inevitably play Mercer or a lower game where it's Vanderbilt, Kentucky, we'll show that on the SEC network. That way it's getting airtime. It brings in revenue. So they did that. And who bought them? ABC and ESPN. They own the SEC network just like Fox owns the Big Ten network. It all started with that Longhorn Network, and when the Longhorn Network started failing, because now the Big 12, it's like, no, this is wrong. We're not getting money. We're going to start messing money around. Eventually, Texas was like, you know what? We'll just go to the SEC. We'll make as much as the Longhorn Network was going to make us, and we'll get guaranteed revenue, because we know that at least one of these schools is going to be in the playoffs. So we're going to get a playoff share every single year from this. And we don't have to ever worry about getting left out, because now we're in the Big 12. We can have 2 losses and lose, and we're still going to make the playoffs. Like, that's the reason Texas, in my opinion, is like getting this like awesome schedule and everything this year. It's creating the brand. Like, they want the brand of Texas to be powerful. They want it to be a staple of the SEC. how better to do it by only giving them one real tough game on the road, or at home versus Georgia. They really probably didn't even think the Texas A&M game was going to be much. It's shaping up to be something, but it's all based upon money. It's like, I know that's a ramble, but it's the market shares. Like, I think ESPN paid the SEC $8 billion to own their games for the next decade. Like, when you start like throwing around the B word, like if you think that committee member they're taking off their hats and hanging them at that door, that garbage that they say on TV, lies.
Yeah.
Like 100%. Like,
No
if you think
chance.
that it doesn't matter what teams make it,
Yeah, I mean, it's just a different AP poll. Like, it's like we're kidding ourselves. Like, we talk about how bad the AP poll is and how bad the BCS was, but then we create this committee, and it's like that's the same thing with extra steps. Like, it's no different.
100%. Well, that was a long enough rant. Outside of that, anything else for college before we inevitably have this rant here in a few more weeks?
Tired of talking about it.
All right. Well, thanks for tuning in. We'll check in next time. Peace out.